Thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. So there's been so much activity that's been taking place over the past year as it pertains to IT modernization in the federal government. And I just want to take a step back and review how this began and where we are and where we're going to go. So in May of 2017, the President issued the Executive Order 13800. And that really set the stage for how this administration was going to do IT modernization for the federal government. Now, doing IT modernization is nothing new. We've been doing this for a while. But the change is the focus of doing network consolidation and shared services. So those were the two focal points the EO 13800 delineated. It also tasked the American Technology Director to work with OMB, DHS, GSA, and Department of Commerce to pull together a report to figure out how we would be able to jumpstart IT modernization across the federal government. And so that started back in June of 2017. Those organizations across the federal government worked with industry partners and delivered a draft report to the President. During that time, there was engagements with additional federal agencies and industry, and the final report was delivered in December of this past year. In that report, it articulated a way to be able to do IT modernization, to kind of jumpstart for federal agencies to really think about how they wanted to be able to use what resources that they had to be able to apply those to do IT modernization. And what I mean by that is focusing on shared services, doing consolidated acquisitions, consolidating their IT budgets, weighing risk, not doing a one-size-fits-all type approach, truly understanding what their assets are, doing high-value assets, modernizing those completely instead of just doing patch management, which is what we have been doing, and truly doing consolidated acquisitions, looking for enterprise acquisition activities, such as what GSA has with the EIS. The other aspect, which is really key, was to figure out a process to be able to identify current processes, policies, and reference architectures that were impacting or impeding the ability to use shared services. An example of that is the Trusted Internet Connection, the TIC. When that was developed back 10 years ago, we didn't have ideas of doing virtualization or shared services or using cloud in a distributed model. So it was really focused on the network. Those policies are preventing us from being able to do and implement the things that we want to be able to modernize now. Now, I'm not saying that we want to get away from the idea of doing secure, operational, effective type things, which is what the TIC policies were doing. We need to figure out a way to be able to have a policy that's agile, that allows us to be able to modernize and keep up with the technology that we have today. And so through that, the IT modernization report identified pilots, activities that would be used to be able to help target which policies that needed to be updated, rescinded, reviewed, revised, as well as to figure out a way to update the reference architectures. And so we've had some success with that. We have two pilot efforts that are taking place today with the Department of Commerce through Census and SBA. And so that started about a month ago. They're on a 90-day sprint. They work closely with DHS, GSA, OSTP, and OMB. And so we do biweekly updates with them. They have their pilot efforts that are going on. And so therefore we have a process in place that we're able to ingest their lessons learned from their pilots. And we're working with DHS and GSA to be able to update the reference architecture. And then OMB is working to update the policies that they have for TIC. And that's just one example, but that was something that was revolutionary that hadn't been done before. So more of that type of creative thinking is needed to be able to make sure that we have the policies that we have in place. We have injection points where we're actually able to leverage tangible data from pilot efforts to be able to influence and change how we're moving forward for that. The next thing that the IT modernization report articulated was the centers of excellence. So GSA stood up 5 centers of excellence, and this is a really great experiment in terms of doing a public-private partnership. So there's these 5 centers of excellence focused on cloud adoption, infrastructure optimization, customer service experience. And the idea is that there's 5 contracts that support these centers of excellence. And right now the partnership is with USDA. So Secretary Perdue has identified not only resources from a financial standpoint, but his best and brightest IT workforce to be working hand in hand with these centers of excellence. And the idea is that they're going to work together to modernize all of USDA in order to get to one network for USDA, as well as to improve the customer-client experience for the farmers. And the idea for the COEs is that they will take this lessons learned from working with USDA, trying to figure out how to break down the barriers in terms of why it's so difficult to do modernization with a federal agency, take those lessons learned and apply it to other federal agencies. But the key in order for these centers of excellence to work is that the federal agency needs to be able to prioritize their funds. They need to identify their IT workforce to work with the centers of excellence. They need to have a plan in place, and that plan in place needs to follow the guidelines that were articulated in the IT modernization plan, which was the fact that we know we're not going to be able to modernize everything. So we need to be able to modernize those high-value assets, fully modernize that, take advantage of acquisition, enterprise acquisition, IT consolidation, doing shared services, not doing boutique, customized type things that are one-offs just for your specific agency, but really leveraging what is offered across the enterprise. And what I mean by that is offered by the federal government. So if Department of Defense or NASA or pick a federal agency is using a cloud service or using a shared service that's effective, perhaps learning from that and seeing that if there is a way to be able to leverage that type of capability instead of having your one-off. The next activity that took place was the Modernizing Government Technology Act. And with that was passed, there's 2 functions, and that's really focused on the funding. So you have the Technology Modernization Fund, which was, the original ask was $500 million. Last month, they only got $100 million. But that's still a lot of money, to be fair. But the idea is that it's going to be this rotating account. There's a board that's chaired by the Fed CIO. Board members are 7 of the leading government acquisition and technical leads. Federal agencies are asked to present their projects to be funded. Because it is $100 million now, it's not to be able to do everything, but it's kind of like a Kickstarter, right? You're able to invest a little bit, capital investment, to see if this works. And then once you're able to do that, you can start seeing some real results. The other thing that the MGT did was come up with a way for working capital funds. So that too is a way for agencies to figure out, instead of using appropriated dollars for their IT funds, and what you see with appropriated dollars is we never get our budget on October 1st. We always have to use our O&M dollars probably in the 3rd quarter, so it forces us to buy legacy stuff or to maintain our legacy stuff. And that's part of our problem with why we can't modernize, is because we're perpetuating the need for our legacy because it's easy to do. We have the funds to be able to do it. So we're trying to break that cycle through the MGT Act by those 2 things. And then the last thing that really ties all of this together is the President's Management Agenda. So that was published back in March. And really, that is what encapsulates everything that has taken place over the past year, from the EO 13800 to the IT modernization plan, the 50 actions that were articulated in the IT modernization plan for federal agencies to jumpstart and start figuring out their strategies for how they're going to do their IT modernization. The establishment of the Centers of Excellence, which is already up and running, working with USDA. They should start actually doing their implementation of the plans that they've been working on starting from March through spring in the July-August timeframe. Develop and drive the new cloud adoption. So I know that we've had cloud names, it was Cloud First. Now OMB came out with Cloud Smart, which I think is a much better way of doing this, because everyone thinks of cloud, they say cloud, we don't know what that means, right? It's just this monolithic thing. And not everything needs to go to a cloud. It's understanding what you have in your environment, and then determining which applications make sense that could be used in a distributed manner, that could be a shared service, and which can't. And so there's a lot of self-awareness that needs to take place, a lot of planning that needs to take place within the federal agencies. But the tools that we've provided in the IT modernization plan should be able to help the CIOs and CISOs and the component acquisition executives to be able to work together to figure out those plans. And then the last thing to make all of this work is obviously the workforce. So trying to have, to retain, recruit, and reskill the best and brightest of your IT workforce. And so those are really the main tenets that are a part of the President's management agenda under his IT modernization pillar. And then the last thing I would like to mention is that for the TMF, there was a few agencies that have provided their projects for submission. 4 agencies were selected, and the reason why those 4 agencies' projects were selected is because they provided the most cross-agency application and customer service impact. And really the guiding principles that the TMF board is using to be able to determine the projects that are going to be selected is the broadest impact across the federal government, most citizen impact, and reusability. And so the Fed CIO, Suzette Kent, she's the chairwoman for this board. She has been making public statements in terms of encouraging federal agencies to continue to submit their plans and their projects so that they to the TMF board for consideration. For FY18, even though right now we're appropriated for $100 million, the request went in for $210 million. If we were going to get that $110 million bump up, the only way that's going to work is if not only we prove out that the TMF funding board works in terms of being able to deliver funds for the federal agencies to do what they need to do, but then the federal agencies need to be able to prove that they're putting the money to good use and we're having a tangible result. So there is a lot of proof of concept, and it works both ways, that this process is going to work, that this idea of doing capital investment across the federal government is going to work for selected projects. And then also, too, it's incumbent upon the federal agencies to be able to ensure that they have a solid plan in place. They have all of the right folks lined up and ready to implement so that we're able to see the results. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to prove ourselves, to show that we can go from 100 million to 200 to the eventual the 500 million, which was the original ask last year. So with that, I just wanted to say that it's been an incredibly enlightening experience working for the EOP for the past 2.5 months. My career really is with DoD. I've been there for 10 years. It's fascinating to see the different interagencies work, the different problem sets that they have. But then when you take a step back, there are a lot of commonality with those problem sets. And I think that with the IT modernization plan, the fact that there was this significant collaboration, not just within the interagencies, but also working with industry, I think it sets a nice roadmap for the federal government to recognize how they should position themselves to be able to begin and really set the stage for them to do IT modernization in the long run. And so I know I said before that we've been doing IT modernization for a while, and we will continue. IT modernization is something that is going to be an enduring, endeavoring effort. And so we need to be committed to that. So we need our leadership to understand that. We need to make sure that we have the perseverance with our leadership. We have the right skill set to be able to do the implementation of the plans that we have in place. So thank you very much.
Danielle, thank you so much. That was wonderful and very informative. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Adilson Jardim, who is the Area Vice President of Public Sector Sales Engineering for Splunk. He's going to give a keynote presentation about the art of the possible. And then after that, just be thinking about some questions that you can have for Adilson and for Danielle, because Danielle's going to stick around with us for a little bit and then answer some questions that you all may have. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Adilson. Thank you.
But how do you take into context what you have in your IT landscape today and convert this into a plan to modernize? Ultimately, everything you do is a question of where do you apply and employ the resources you have, whether they're budgetary, people, or even aging legacy modernization, etc. So we can think of these in terms of the various layers of a stack. And ultimately, the only approach we've really been able to manifest is going after each individual layer and hoping we make some incremental progress against that layer. So whether we're talking about the infrastructure or the application and services layer, we've got to consider, how do we even start to enumerate these? Most of you have IT environments that stem into the thousands of machines, servers, applications, devices. So how do we get that enumerated so you can quantify what your modernization effort looks like? And then ultimately, the elephant in the room is always, is this secure? So cloud adoption, I think, has been a significant challenge for everyone, partly because we cannot always quantify what the cloud security model looks like. So FedRAMP has gone a long way to enable that for all of us in the industry, to give you and provide products that are secure and can be launched securely in the cloud. But ultimately, those products might not represent everything you need in your technology landscape and environment. So let's talk a little about machine data and what that is. Within the context of your environments today, every single element that you have, every device, every machine, every application is constantly spitting out a lot of information. Information that you probably do not readily see and might not get to. Many of you have log aggregation initiatives or platforms, for example. Have you ever considered what's in those logs? What we see from those logs is a stream of data, information, and intelligence about what's actually happening with these devices. From a code management perspective, for example, instrumentation and applications, instrumentation at the application layer, the middleware layer, the middle tiers, the database tiers, the infrastructure tiers, are all spat out in this form of machine data. So imagine if you could peek into that and collect that data and visualize it. So what kind of things might I find in there? Well, I could find that someone used a credential in one system that happened to be the same credential used in another system. If I'm not looking across all of that machine data, those systems might very well be completely isolated today. You're not going to have a temporal aspect, meaning a time-based aspect that says at 12:01 p.m., something happened across many different systems that may or may not have a security implication, an operational implication, or a business implication, a mission outcome implication. So imagine what you could find in there if everything we do in terms of breadcrumbs and digital footprints are captured not at the application level, spitting out an error or a message, but rather at the instrumentation level and the logging level for all these systems. So now I start to create a line of sight across a time-bound element, a temporal element, that gives me a sense of what's actually happening in these environments and what can I do about it. And more importantly, what about these should I consider as high-value assets or targets for modernization? So I'm going to walk us through a really interesting example of a state agency that was forced to undergo a very similar initiative around IT modernization. So, state of Louisiana had an interesting operating requirement. Not unlike the Management Act and IT Modernization Act, they were forced to consolidate and modernize their infrastructure and IT technology organizations. Now, the state might not resonate, especially here at the federal audience, and the federal agencies tend to generally be a lot bigger than most of the state agencies. So let's put that into context. This was an initiative to consolidate IT information technology delivery across 20 executive branch agencies. There are over 180 agencies in the state of Louisiana, or IT operating infrastructure. So under an executive order, there was to reevaluate and initiate a transformation and modernization initiative. They created the Office of Technology Services as a shared service provider, and they started to consider how that would look in terms of delivering shared services. Now, an interesting point, as we think about pointy-haired boss back there, they were a cost recovery agency formulation. There was no budget allocated to them. No pressure there. So how do you do that when you actually don't have an allowance to go modernize? So what were they actually facing? Of those executive branch agencies they were looking at, even within them, they had siloed departments. Their citizen service delivery was fragmented. When we talk about data strategy issues, not unlike in many of your agencies here, when you think about what a citizen has to do to engage departments across multiple different applications, just the very notion of being recognized as a citizen or a person is really hard to do. If I have to create my identity in one service, let's say for an eligibility program, and then for a completely different service somewhere else, I've now fragmented what my identity as a citizen looks like across all these systems. So the redundancy and duplication of the data and the aspects of data, the profiles that they provide, were distributed across all of these agencies. They had no enterprise data architecture. They had no approach to how you consolidate that. So what they ended up doing in this motion of creating a shared service was to identify the high-value services that they could create across these horizontal paradigms. That actually translated over the last 3 years into a $70 million savings for the state of Louisiana. OTS now provides shared services to all these agencies, and most importantly, especially as we talk about budget and recovery, they've created a framework for charging back. But it's not just charging back of the services in the sense of what we consider a chargeback. They've defined fixed cost allowances and allocations, and they've defined pass-through models so that they can charge the agency purely for the service that they're requesting or the assets they need without any uptick or any overhead costs on that. So an interesting model of actually showing, we talk about chargeback, but they started with showback. This is what you actually use. If you have a net new requirement, this is what it will look like. And in so doing, they're able to engender trust and actual reliance on their services because of the transparency they've brought to it. So let's talk about some of those services that they delivered. When they looked at what they could affect, that master data management aspect of what a citizen looks like across these services was one of the key things that they were looking for. How they deliver communications to state citizens and the other agencies, aka their actual stakeholders. They looked at the identity and access framework, which translates very rapidly into this is likely going to be a lot more secure than having hundreds of IT systems that are independent of one another, fragmented, that have to be secured too. So how do you do that without being able to function through an identity access management framework as well? And then they added services around electronic document management, storing, classifying, categorizing. And really what in their environment, in the shared service, ties a lot of this together is a service-oriented architecture. So their service bus and business rules engines became instrumental in how they align all these functions, but also how they meter the activity and the services delivered to the agencies. So how did this evolve then? Well, they realized that all of this was actually being tied together using that same machine data I described earlier. Because they didn't have the time, capacity, or quite frankly, the budget to go create very unique monitoring and visibility platforms into each layer. So they created this glue using machine data to surface up what's actually going on. that same data I described earlier isn't just giving us insights or digital footprints around security, but also performance and business impact and access and busyness, the resource management around this massive infrastructure that they're able to consolidate. So for the state today, their OTS organization provides for each service that they're offering this type of real-time visibility into what's going on with the service, not with the technology. Are we providing the service to the agency? Does it look good? Is it degrading? Is it failing? Is there something we need to do differently? Before consolidation, let alone before leveraging the insights that were in that data, they had no idea whether there was an outage in a particular agency, whether citizen service was impacted. But they've taken that further and defined in these business rules, which is how the stakeholders engage with the applications and services, they've started to measure the component health around each business rule. Are they able to function? Is the technology affected? Are they engaging effectively? And then ultimately moving all of this information they're able to gather, and with a lot of insight, being able to translate those into the utilization for the stakeholders. So when they look at the cost recovery, they can very accurately portray and show the constituents and the citizen agencies what they leveraged inside the environment. So this has set them up in a very unique way. If an agency requires additional infrastructure or additional capacity or net new services, they're not guessing at how that gets deployed or implemented and how they'll be able to manage and track what they're actually using from those investments. So Danielle mentioned the $100 million in the fund today. Well, if $70 million is a savings for a state with roughly 4.5 million citizens, then $100 million is probably something that could go a long way if we can identify which types of services this might apply to at the federal and agency level. So, what insights can we actually gain from all this different data I'm talking about? So machine data, certainly from our perspective, is something that is a non-intrusive and certainly much less intrusive way of understanding what's going on around the environments. If I want to consider what I'm going to move into a cloud environment, whether it's an application, a service, or infrastructure, what better way than to actually understand what I'm running today and what's being used and how it's being used? So when we first started with these shifts to the cloud, the biggest observation, certainly the biggest complaint I'd get from a lot of the agencies and folks I'd work with is, well, you don't understand how big it is that we have. We have 2,000 servers, or we have 2,000 machines, or 1,000, or 500. I don't know what that looks like if I shift part of this to the cloud. Well, the I don't know is because we've generally focused on asset management or individual enumeration rather than utilization, capacity, and resource management. So how do we tie that information together? Because we need both. We need enumeration, but we also need insight into that. So for us, it's bring all of that information together, because the most important aspect we can give it is a time slice. What happens at any particular point in time across this massive infrastructure we're talking about? What is in this massive infrastructure we're talking about? If we can enumerate it and we can provide visibility and insight into it, then all of a sudden, we start to see what's actually going on across my space. How and what could I leverage across other programs or projects? Which ones of these services are duplicated? If you don't know they exist, you don't know if they're duplicates. So with that, you start to identify the targets and the assets that are good candidates for cloud migration. But not just can we move them to the cloud, how would we? How much does it cost when I move it to the cloud? As many of you know, if you've already moved some assets to the cloud, utilization, resource monitoring, etc., costs money when you put it in the cloud. You have to meter that. You will get a bill that reflects that. So the better able you are to reflect what that future bill might look like and that resource utilization looks like, the more effectively you can manage to your budget and your constraints. And then when we think about what it means to improve the workforce and reskill the workforce, the reality is, in this really complex landscape of lots of IT, microservices, lots of different technologies, what are we asking you to do when we say reskill the workforce? Which technology? Where do you start? If I have a resource and an individual that's really competent on mainframe technology, Where do I get them started? Do I teach them virtualization? Do I teach them development skills? Do I teach them cloud management and monitoring skills? Which one is most relevant to reskill our workforce? Well, the only simple way to do that is to eliminate at least some of how do I manage this component? What do I do with this technology? And give them all of that data in a way that they're able to actually interpret not what the technology does, but what's going on with the service. If I'm responsible for maintaining the citizen registration service, I shouldn't need to know every single technology that delivers that. And I think that's the only way we'll be able to enable the workforce of the future, is to try and limit and reduce the amount of complexity that they have to contend with and understand and learn. So, coming back to our network modernization and the IT modernization report, we can think about that workforce context in the form of how do we simplify the tools for people. Not how do we reskill them just for the sake of reskilling in technology, but how do we streamline and simplify what they need to be focused on. What processes can we change? Once we understand better what these environments look like holistically, what can we change in terms of acquisition, in terms of consolidation, but also in terms of delivery? Because ultimately, we can acquire technology quicker, we might be able to do some interesting things with it, but ultimately the mission, whether it's citizen services or protection or security, is ultimately what we have to deliver. And then the technology becomes a vehicle to deliver all those, instead of focusing on technology for the sake of that technology modernization. So, pointy-haired boss might have actually been right. Let's just get started. We have to start somewhere with how we enable these environments and start moving them forward. Thank you.
Great. Now we're going to just take a minute and get your questions. We have two. We have Adilson and we have Danielle here to talk with you all and share some of their insights. So we have microphones around the room. So we do have a question right here. Just wait for the microphone to get to you because we do have a live audience.
Hi. We have a live audience, but not a live.
We have a live audience. We have a live streaming audience as well, so we want to make sure that they can hear.
This is for Danielle. You were referring to the Centers of Excellence at GSA and that they're working with USDA. I know it's relatively recent that they've been set up, but I'm curious to know, is there going to be any visibility their work process, and because there are other agencies looking at this and want to be part of the process, is that possible right now, or do we need to wait to see what happens with USDA?
That's a good question. Right now, so the contract was awarded for the Centers of Excellence last month, March 14th. So from March until June, those specific contractors are working with USDA folks to be able to build out the plans. So that part's still going. So they're really storming right now, to use a DoD phrase. So once they are able to get in the July, August timeframe, they'll be able to start implementing those plans. We do want to have transparency. There needs to be an openness in terms of what the processes are, because these centers of excellence are not just serving USDA. They will be serving and working with the other federal agencies as well. I know they're trying to figure out the process to identify when the next federal agency will be in the queue for the COE. I do not have that information. GSA is the one that's really leading this. Their focus right now is USDA, because a lot of pressure has been put on this, because USDA has contributed a lot of money to this, working with GSA as well as the Centers of Excellence. So there is a lot for USDA on this, but this is also a testament to the fact that if this works, and it works well, that we would be able to translate that to the other federal agencies. And I also believe that with USDA, they want to share, their best practices, their templates in terms of the planning that they did with other federal agencies, so that those federal agencies that are interested in using the Centers of Excellence aren't starting from scratch.
Great. Do we have another question? Right there?
This question's also for Danielle. You were talking about ways to jumpstart the IT modernization, and you mentioned that we're going to focus more on shared services, but at the same time you said that we need to not do a one-size-fits-all, and usually when people think shared service, they think one-size-fits-all. So can you kind of elaborate a bit?
Sure. I think it's because when we use terms like shared service or cloud or even IT modernization, that just carries this weight that is this one singular thing. And that's not really what it is. And so what I meant by that was in the IT modernization report, I itemized ways to be able to figure out, one, to really evaluate within the internal federal agency what your high value assets are. So what does that mean? What does your infrastructure look like? And then to be able to target what are those pieces that truly do need to be modernized. And then also to figure out of those applications of that infrastructure, what makes sense to be moved to be used as a shared service and not continue using legacy or your current operating structure. So I know that's still generalities, and it's really difficult to have that deep dive conversation without having the next level of detail in terms of engaging with a specific federal agency to figure out what exactly they have. And I think that's why the importance of the Centers of Excellence are. So the Centers of Excellence are really focused on cloud adoption, infrastructure optimization, customer service, data analytics. So those Centers of Excellence will be able to work with a specific federal agency, in this case USDA, to figure out what they actually have. So there's that sense of awareness, and then to be able to do the refined plans to figure out what makes sense from an acquisition standpoint, what makes sense to be, what needs to move to a shared service, what needs to be consolidated, and what really just needs to just stay as it is. But I think that the thing of it is that it's not binary. It's not an either or. I stay as I am because I'm comfortable with it. I know what this is, or I move everything to a shared service or to a cloud. There has to be a middle ground.
Do we have another question out there? Right there. Just wait for the mic.
Danielka, a lot of the that you're talking about, getting after consolidation and shared services, indicates that we need to have some ITSM. How does DoD
I can take a crack at that.
Let's do that since I've answered two.
So thank you for the question. I think, so what I was describing earlier actually lends itself as the platform for what service management could look like. I think what would probably be best is to start thinking of services again in terms of the technical components. So I generally see a lot of folks really focusing on what we think of as events or a technology incident and referring to those as services. So in a sense, they certainly are. But the service management paradigm should really begin with the consumer in mind, whether that's a citizen or another agency or another stakeholder, or even delivery of security, for example. So how do we take all of these elements that are inside an IT landscape and deliver service from that perspective first? So the service management should begin with what are we trying to deliver? In the case of modernization, I think what it lends itself to is if we understand what we have in our IT environments better, then we can relate those back up to the service. How do all these technical components contribute or stack up to actually deliver a service to our constituents? So from that perspective, I think what we've always focused on is here are the blinky lights, or here are the indicators that tell me a server went down or there's a network that's not performing or degrading, which is really good in terms of reacting to that infrastructure layer and doing something to fix that, but not necessarily good in terms of understanding the impact to the users or the constituents. So we need both views. We still need that technical view that tells me something's going on in the environment that I've got to go fix, but we also need the context of how is this impacting my mission or operations or my constituency. And if we take that perspective in terms of IT service management, then we can start to differentiate between, is this a modernization candidate, for example, or is this really a break-fix type of scenario, and how do I prioritize those? So when we see the event management across these large environments in the federal agencies especially, you cannot keep up with 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 types of events going on in these environments every day. Then we've got to add some analytics to that. So how do we reduce the noise? What are false positives? How do we cluster these events so that we don't have analysts or IT operations or support folks chasing every single alert? So those are things, and I think you'll hear some more about that today, where it's really creating and evolving event management and service management into this service-focused delivery of capability to mission. And it ties back into, again, the whole modernization discussion, as I think we all recognize the realities of that. In delivering a service, I might have really old mainframes, I might have client desktop applications, etc. And that's okay. They're all still part of and contributing to delivering the service to a constituency. So how do we then isolate and identify which ones of those in the stack we can start to modernize and where? I hope that gives you a sense of certainly how I approach it and how we think about it.
Any other questions out there? So I'll ask a final question then for both speakers. When it comes to carrying out the executive order, where are the opportunities that you see for agencies to get quick wins? And I'll start with you, Danielle.
Yeah, so we were actually talking about this before we started, and it's nice to think that we can get quick wins, but they're really difficult to achieve, particularly when we are talking about such a challenging endeavor as doing IT modernization. I think what the IT modernization report was trying to go after was some of those tangible quick wins or setting us up for a quick success. So you see that with the Centers of Excellence that USDA is doing that. Albeit, when we forecasted this out, that was in December. It's now April. We're still in the planning phase for that. July, August timeframe is when we could start seeing some type of implementation. I don't know if we would qualify that as a quick win. Certainly from a federal government perspective, that's pretty timely, but maybe from private industry, not so much. The other thing that we're working on in terms of having the federal agencies work through their plans and projects to be able to submit to the TMF. That's also something, those 4 agencies that were selected, once they receive the funds to be able to start implementing that could be considered a quick win. Really working and partnering with other federal agencies, I think, would be something of use, leveraging the CIO and CISO executive councils to be able to get what your other federal agencies are working on, their plans and practices, to see if you're able to use some of that to be able to help with your planning of that. And then also, too, I think the other thing that's probably going to be more transformative, but it's something that needs to start in the planning phase right now, is how to empower the CIO and the CISO to work with that C-suite. So you have your CEO, your component acquisition executive, your CIO working together to figure out what that plan is for IT modernization and how best to use the funds to go after the acquisition, to be able to do the implementation in order for the ultimate, which is the citizen or customer experience, your operational mission. So having that totality. Right now, a lot of federal agencies are a little fragmented where you have your component executives off to the side. The CIOs are only guiding or able to influence after the fact, and we know that that's not very helpful. So figuring out a way to be able to have the CIO lockstep with the component acquisition executive and whoever is the CIO or the CEO to make sure that we actually have a holistic IT modernization plan that could be executed.
Right. Give you the final word.
Well, thank you. And what Danielle said, obviously, and I think that's the context really, really matters. And I think the concept of shared services, for those that remember financial management line of business, HR line of business, we've started these initiatives, which we were talking about earlier. This isn't new, right? We haven't just decided, hey, shared services are interesting, let's try this. I think the challenge is, as Danielle mentioned, we've always got competing priorities around what the mission and operating requirements might look like versus what infrastructure and technology looks like. And I think if we go back to some of the guiding principles of the federal enterprise architecture, It's how do we start with the mission driving what the requirements look like, and then technology, and all of us in the technology field should be thinking in terms of delivering services to that mission. And I think that's really should always be the guiding principle, is we're all here to deliver service, capability, and capacity, not to think of it in terms of this is my technology or this is what I run, etc. And I think that guiding principle can then define other things like what is it that I need to do, and how does the CIO get a seat at the table on the operating side so that that level of service becomes what the agency depends on and relies on. And I think the Louisiana example I gave, that initiative started 4 years ago, and you think of the amount of progress they made, not by considering it in terms of we're going to come out with new widgets, but what is it you're trying to do and how can we rationalize, consolidate, and save on that, but actually provide you a better level of service than what you have today. I think that was the catalyst that made them successful and makes that such a really interesting story, in that they approached it from that perspective. We're going to create something that's meaningful and valuable and actually reduces the burden on the sister agencies and dependent agencies. Again, not suggesting that we don't do that generally. I think when we look across our federal agencies, there are so many operating missions, right? If we consider Homeland Security as a great example, there are very many operating missions within each department and component, et cetera. So how do you rationalize all of those? Well, you start with what is it that everyone uses? What is it that everyone needs? And is there a way to deliver that more effectively and streamline that? And I think that's what propels it into being meaningful and a dependency for the rest of the departments.
I want to just thank you both for just a wonderful kickoff to our morning. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.